Okay, welcome and good evening. My name is Hillary and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the New York Transit Museum. Thanks so much for joining us. This evening is the first episode in a new series called Mining the Archives, where we're going to be pulling from our extensive collections to bring you all these new stories about the history of transit. Today's edition is The Citizen Inventor, and it's going to be presented by the museum's own content manager, Polly Desjardins. But first, a couple quick announcements. If you haven't been, please join us at the Transit Museum. It's a wonderful space for all ages. We're located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned subway station. We're open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal. And now is a great time to come shop for our holiday gifts, and you can find things for everyone on your list. There's a ton of fantastic goodies on sale. And you can also catch the holiday train show while you're in Grand Central, which is so much fun. We also still have our holiday trains running in Manhattan on Sundays through the end of the month. I'll put some links in the chat so that you can learn more about those opportunities. Now for today's program, if you would like captions, you can click down where it says CC Show Captions. If you don't see that option, click on the three dots at the bottom of your screen and you should see the full menu of options there. Zoom has also recently updated, so if you're not seeing the presentation, just go to the top of the Zoom window where it says Meeting. There's going to be a little arrow, and if you click on the arrow, you can toggle between the presentation and kind of the group. Now, there should be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to add questions and comments in the chat throughout the program, and I'll be collecting those comments and sharing them at the end of the presentation. Now, Polly Desjardins has put together this fascinating dive into our archives, and so without further ado, I'll hand it off to Polly.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I'm just going to dive in and get started. So the New York Transit Museum looks after a really huge collection of objects, photographs, and ephemera of all kinds related to public transportation in the city and the region. We have at present two main locations, our home in the decommissioned Court Street station in downtown Brooklyn and our gallery annex in Grand Central Terminal. We have three physical stores, an online store, and we maintain two archive spaces. One is at 130 Livingston Street, which is also the home of New York City Transit, and here where I am tonight in Industry City in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. So I'm lucky enough, as I said, to have a desk here in Sunset Park where, you can often find me wandering through the shelves that you can see on the screen, gawping at all of the amazing stuff that we have. I really have one of the best jobs in the world, I'll just say it. I want to set the scene for our program today, which is focusing on a teeny tiny piece of a huge collection, which is all about the Board of Transportation. So the Board of Transportation was established 100 years ago in 1924, essentially to build and operate a city-run subway system that became known as the IND, or the Independent Subway. Eventually, the board took control of the two private subway companies, the IRT, or Interborough Rapid Transit Company, and the BMT, the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Corporation. And they took them over in 1940, unifying a system under municipal control that had been growing since 1904. Within this particular collection are decades worth of ideas and suggestions that were sent into the State Transit Commission, the mayor's office, and to the board itself from, just a variety of people, companies, all proffering solutions to perceived problems, many of which focused on city planning, the severely overcrowded conditions on public transportation, and growing street congestion. This is what they were thinking about. Today, we're going to focus on ideas from the 1920s, from just 6 individuals who really wanted a chance to make New York a better place to live in and visit, and had the gumption to pass along their proposals. Unfortunately, at this point, I don't have too much information beyond what exists in the documents that we're going to look at together. So sort of specific questions about what happened in the following decades might be hard to answer, but let's go ahead and dive in anyway. And we're going to sort of begin with some context. In the early 20th century, as the population rapidly expanded, new transportation technologies like the subway and automobiles were changing the development of the city and the region and expanding the area in which someone could live and reasonably get to and from work, even though I have to say living conditions were still pretty deplorable in many parts of New York. In 1922, the Committee on the Plan of New York and its Environs met for the first time, really as urban planners began analyzing many aspects of city life, including transit. The Regional Plan Association, as they were called, would eventually present the first regional plan in 1929, proposing an elaborate network of highways, railroads, and parks, along with residential, commercial, and industrial centers as the foundation of the physical and social development of the region. Just like this committee, New Yorkers and other interested citizens became more engaged with the ideas of city and transit planning as the environment around them and their lives, were changing. So this image of traffic off the Williamsburg Bridge in 1929 and this clip of the classic Speedy from 1928 give us a lovely visual taste of what the streets were like. Not all the time, but at times. Speedy, of course, is a comedy, so much of the action is kind of exaggerated and it's meant to make us laugh. But in terms of public transportation on the streets, there were trolleys and streetcars that ran on fixed tracks and double-deck motor buses that didn't. Above the streets were elevated train lines providing transit to millions daily. Not only had the population of New York increased dramatically, but also riding habits, as you can see on the slide. But conditions for riders were getting worse as congestion increased, while expansion of services just took so long. At the same time, the advent of the automobile began to change how people got around and the urban landscapes into which they came. They were symbols of modernity and status, and New Yorkers embraced the car to the point that in 1900, they already owned about a third of the approximately 8,000 cars that were in the country at the time. And there were 50 car manufacturer showrooms in Manhattan in the 1920s. So imagine seeing that kind of progression from horse-drawn vehicles to what we're seeing on the screen. 100 years ago, people were thinking of the future and the possibilities for their lives, especially when it came to fundamentals like transportation. Remember that back then, despite their increasing popularity, most folks still didn't have a car and relied on public transportation for their travel needs. Okay, we're going to have to leave Speedy behind, as fun as it is. So say goodbye to Babe Ruth there. So we're going to just take a moment to sort of broaden our lens and see what other sort of inventions or products were being introduced in the 20s, just before I introduce the archival materials. So interestingly enough, traffic lights didn't come along, traffic signals really actually, until 1920, with the first being installed on Fifth Avenue. The first working television set was invented by John Logie Baird in the 20s. Clarence Birdseye invented flash freezing. So we just began to learn how to keep products for a long time. So the frozen products industry begins with Birdseye. The Freer chewing gum company made a mistake and created bubble gum, the first of which was called Double Bubble in 1928. So what have we got? We've got traffic lights, TV, frozen peas, bubble gum, Band-Aids. An employee of Johnson & Johnson's wife would consistently burn herself while cooking, so Earl invented the Band-Aid for her. in 1920. Reese's peanut butter cups, they used to be a penny and they were known as penny cups in 1923. They are still his most popular product. And then Kleenex. Kleenex originally was a paper mask in the First World War, but by the 20s, it was there for you removing your cold cream. So as we're thinking about all the things that we're going to look at today, this is also what was happening sort of generally in people's lives. The city was growing in the 20s. It was a manufacturing hub and increasingly the business and finance center of the country. As building technology improved, as well as the technology for elevators, more and more office buildings and skyscrapers were constructed for all the workers that were commuting in and out of the city on a rapid transit system that had been steadily expanding for the last few decades. New Yorkers had already put up with a lot of disruption and noise and dirt associated with building tunnels and stations under the city streets, often right on people's doorsteps. Little did they know back then how much more was to come. In the mid-1920s, construction of the IND or independent subway system was just beginning, with the first line under 8th Avenue in Manhattan, which is today's A-line service. These two collection images that we're showing on the slide, they show work that was happening on the 50th Street station and showing us some of what residents had to deal with over the many years that it took for this subway line to open. And this brings us to our first example of an ordinary New Yorker offering ideas and suggestions to solve a problem as she saw it. So let's hear what Katherine Emmons, who lived on West 55th Street in 1926. Let's hear what she had to say about the subway construction happening in her neighborhood, since she lived so close to the work sites we just saw. She sent this letter to the New York State Transit Commission, as well as the City Board of Transportation. And I'm just going to say this is with thanks to my colleague, Rebecca, who's a born and bred New Yorker, for her reenactment assistance.
Dear sir, may I call your attention to the fact that very few of the people who have to pass the workings of the new subway on 8th Avenue are not unpleasantly affected, either in their eyes or throats, by the clouds of mineral dust carelessly ejected into the atmosphere. I would not mention this if I had not thought of a simple contrivance which, the men whom I have consulted agree, ought to abate the nuisance. This is a sort of coop made of wire covered with cloth or burlap, which could be moistened and placed on the ground over the end of the drill to receive the shower of dust it sends up, which must be bad indeed for the workers, since so troublesome to passers by. This rough sketch may give an idea. If necessary, it might be collapsible, but my idea is to make it as simple as possible in view of the difficulty you sometimes encounter in enforcing the use of such devices. I would also like to suggest the application of a shock absorber to the above-mentioned drill, the effect of the constant and violent vibration being injurious. Yours very truly, Katherine Emmons.
Now, it isn't surprising to me that this suggestion came from a woman at a time when house cleaning was a primary responsibility for women, and when dirt and dust from subway construction must have made this task so challenging. I mean, it's challenging today, but back then must have been awful. Though her idea was, pretty basic and inexpensive to fabricate, she didn't even warrant a reply. You can see right there, no reply. I'm not sure that any such device was ever developed, possibly because a cloth coop may have been more of a hazard than a help when using this kind of tool. I really don't know. I look at it and I sort of think of a vacuum cleaner bag collecting all the dust and the dirt. And I wonder how often they would have had to change that out and where would they have emptied it? And, but I give her, all the credit for having the moxie to do the drawing and just to write in. Another regular citizen who voiced his ideas to the city was a man called John Hosy, who was a worker for the Brooklyn Sewer Bureau. Now, he wrote to Mayor Jimmy Walker in 1927 because he wanted to draw attention to something that he thought would be an easy saving in money and coal for the city, which was using the power of the of the sewers to generate electricity. So the mayor's office passed it along to the Board of Transportation for their consideration as a way to move the subway. So during this time period, the chief engineer of the Bureau of Sewers for the area of Greater New York was a man named Major Henry Assison. He identified that the existing sewers in Brooklyn were not going to be enough for the growing borough, and that something had to be done about the raw sewage that was emptying into Jamaica Bay. He even predicted that rainfall would slowly increase over time, an early recognition of climate change, perhaps, maybe not, and that the sewer system would have a really hard time coping with all the extra water. Now, after a particularly bad rainstorm in 1902 caused major flooding of homes and businesses in Brooklyn, 2 huge new trunk sewers were constructed that were the biggest of their time. Eventually, public health experts identified the problems with New Yorkers bathing in raw sewage at Brooklyn beaches, and the city built its first water pollution control plant in Mill Basin. Hosy, having seen these impressive sewers, described the force of the water running through them as having the same power as Niagara Falls, which would be a truly mighty force. He obviously had great faith in the engineers of the time, particularly the Board of Transportation, who could harness this power somehow to run the subway system, though he never makes any suggestions or ideas for how to do this himself. In the end, the city's referral of this suggestion to transit was rebuffed by Mr. Leahy, the engineer of equipment and operation. And he said, there is no doubt that such a power development could be made, but it quite certainly would be so expensive that the same amount of power could be obtained at less cost in other ways. Interesting. And Mr. Leahy is going to come up again. John Hosy was looking out for his city. He, like other municipal employees on the ground, could see things and imagine things that others couldn't, particularly about how the city functioned and its many problems and inefficiencies. And he wasn't alone. By the 1920s, New York had its streetcar system, its elevated train system, motor buses, private cars and taxis, and new subway lines. And yet it still wasn't enough. The subways in particular were severely overcrowded during rush hours, subjecting passengers to conditions that people really saw as untenable. In 1924, for example, the Women's Subway Committee of the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce denounced the conditions on transit as atrocious, and they suggested separate subway cars for women, not for the first time, by the way, as well as construction of more subway lines as soon as possible. At the same time, the New York Times predicted that by 2033, the population of New York would balloon to 100 million in a city where buildings have to shoot up to the sky to keep within a limited area, where progression through the jostling mobs practically resolves itself into a free-for-all. So there were obvious concerns about overcrowding in general. There were already federal restrictions to immigration that had been enacted in the 1920s. And in New York, some of the most crowded and congested places were experienced whilst traveling on public transportation. No wonder then for the next proposal that was brought to the Board of Transportation in 1926. It was a practical plan suggested by Robert Repair. Imagine a much smaller subway system, fewer lines, fewer trains, fewer stations, but still trying to carry millions on systems designed for many less. The IRT, the first subway company that opened in 1904, began operation with much shorter trains than we're used to today, 5 cars and 8 cars. And they had a carrying capacity that fell far short, really, of the needs of commuters not very long after it opened. Over time, cars were added onto trains, but in doing so, they were faced with platforms that were too short to fit the full length of the train, making boarding and alighting difficult for efficient operations. Beginning as early as 1911, the IRT began lengthening platforms where they could, though the majority were extended in the 1950s and 60s. In some cases, this led to redundancy and the closure of stations on the IRT that were simply too close together. In 1926, Mr. Repair sent in an outline for a super service of trains that negated the need to lengthen platforms, making his proposal really quite attractive to the officials at the Board of Transportation. His simple idea provided for color-coded express train cars that would correspond with color-coded platforms at stations. Trains could have up to twice as many cars as they were running with his plan, but he proposed 12-car trains. Some cars would hang over the edge of the platforms depending on the color of the cars and the color on the platform. He patented his train system in 1926. And this is how he described it. If the trains are divided into 3 sections, such, for instance, as a white center section and red and blue end sections, the platforms will each be divided into a white section and either a blue or red section. Thus, the central section of the train will stop at every platform, and the red sections and blue sections will stop at certain platforms only. By this arrangement, passengers traveling from a red and white platform to a red and white platform will use red cars. Passengers traveling from a blue and white platform will travel on blue cars. The white cars may be used for traveling from any station to any other station, since they will register at all station platforms. Now, this scheme, he believed, would be cost effective because there would be no tunnel construction costs or platform lengthening. All it needed was more cars, more power and shops, with a small number of trainmen and sort of minor costs, he says, for adjustments of block signals and for markers on trains and platforms. Though his plan wasn't unique, the chief engineer of the Board of Transportation, Mr. Robert Ridgway, believed that Repair's plan was the best of a bunch that had been proposed to increase capacity on existing services to help relieve all the awful overcrowding on the subway. However, the engineer of equipment and operation, our Mr. Leahy, again pointed out several problems with his ideas, including that there would be crowding on the platforms at certain points as people jostled to get on the right cars, that there would be confusion for passengers about the color-coded scheme, although in all of this reading, everybody seemed to think that New Yorkers would get used to it very quickly because they're very savvy, and that the worst that would happen is that a person would go one stop too far. But he also pointed out that there would be delays in getting on and off of the train as people tried to move from one part of the train to another. He said that longer trains would interfere with the IRT operations because the stations were really close together, and that might lead to a reduction in line capacity. The signal system was designed to provide maximum operation for 10-car trains. And so it would have had to have been moved and sort of redesigned to account for longer trains. All of this, the whole system would need more power to move these longer trains, right? And all of these additional cars, signals, increased power and facilities would really cost a significant amount of money. Nevertheless, they still believed that Repair's super service of trains was an interesting idea, and they were willing to sort of look further into it. And I'm sure that there were many studies done of overcrowding and how to fix it. But even ideas like this that seemed fairly simple and easy to install on the face proved again to be pretty complicated and perhaps too expensive after all. But you know what? This just didn't stop the public from sending in their suggestions. Henry Swift, our next citizen inventor, he certainly believed that he had an idea that would work, and he was eager for the city and the Board of Transportation officials to hear it and to try it out. Henry Swift's family hailed from Millbrook, New York, about 90 miles upstate from the city, where they had run a coal and lumber business since 1869, the year they also received a delivery of coal on the very first freight train that ever rolled into their town. Now, whatever happened in the intervening years isn't clear, but Henry must have traveled to and spent some time in New York City making observations and formulating his ideas, or perhaps he'd been studying the situation from afar. Nevertheless, he filed his first patent application for an overhead railway in 1924 and began soliciting the mayor and the Board of Transportation in 1926. As you can see, he wrote to them many times. Swift often talked in disparaging terms about public transportation that was already running in the city. He called the elevated lines the old Rattle Trap, and noted how there was talk already about tearing them down. And he saw the subway as inconvenient for passengers and too costly to build, saying, "They can never be as convenient or pleasant as this will be." His railway, however, would allow passengers to travel in the open with light and air, and would provide for a second level of sidewalks and stores, doubling the capacity of the street. And because it was a suspended monorail design, there would be less noise and dirt than the elevated lines that were already running. Beginning in February 1924, he wrote every few weeks, really impatient to get some kind of positive response from the city. By August, Mr. Swift was asking to demonstrate his idea. Would it not be possible to try out the system on a spur or short line, such as that at Grand Central Station? He said, referring to the spur of the 3rd Avenue elevated railroad that ended right outside Grand Central Terminal, seen here on the image on the right. This demonstration, of course, never took place, and I haven't actually been able to locate a response from the city or the Board of Transportation back to poor Mr. Swift. It could be there, I just haven't come across it. He claims in a few of the letters that he didn't want to make any money from this invention, but rather was insistent that he only wanted to help alleviate the terrible situation in the city. But I'm just curious as to how his overhead railway would have worked alongside the elevated train lines that were already running, and whether Mr. Swift intended to demolish what was already existed in order to install his system. I mean, certainly his idea for a second level of stores and sidewalks above those on the surface would have, I don't know, provided more capacity for stuff. But how would that have left the ground floor businesses and dwellings, I wonder? I think Henry's imagination actually was a little limited compared to the next citizen inventor, though both of them envisioned transportation above the streets in the open air and thought that really that was the answer. So William H. Tigerman was born in Hungary in 1871 and immigrated to the United States with his family. He lived in a few places around the country, including Pennsylvania and Missouri. In 1907, Tigerman purchased a patent by a Swiss inventor named David Fouts for an elevated railway that he named the Tigerman Suspension Railway. Before suggesting the system for New York City, actually, Tigerman went to Cincinnati, Ohio, because it was a center of population and manufacturing, and he tried to convince them to let him build a line between Cincinnati and Dayton. He claimed that his cars would be able to run at speeds up to 135 miles per hour and drastically cut the time of travel between cities across the country. For example, he suggested that they could get from Cincinnati to New York in just 7 hours. For comparison, I think the journey on Amtrak today is about 13 hours between Cleveland and New York. Just as Henry Swift was convinced that going above the streets was the answer, Tigerman saw the benefits of this and also envisioned a suspended train that could ride in tunnels as well, enabling a combined subway and elevated system in one that would carry passengers from the city out into the suburbs and back. One particular advantage that Tigerman points out with an overhead hanging train is the ability to use low platforms or low boarding, which keeps passengers well away from the rails and the power supply, which is above, unlike, of course, in a regular railroad like the subway, where passengers were more vulnerable to accidents near tracks and the electricity. Though Tigerman owned a patent for one design of an overhead railway, there were others, one of which was already in operation in Europe at this time. And in fact, Tigerman used it as an example of how successful this type of railway could be. This is the Wuppertal-Schwebebahn. This is the oldest electric elevated railway with hanging cars in the world. Invented by Eugene Langen, a German engineer who did pioneering work on the internal combustion engine in the mid-1800s. This elevated suspension railway was installed before Tigerman decided to purchase the Pfalz patent and served as an inspiration, demonstrating that the technology could work and be successful. The Schwebebahn tracks and stations were built between 1897 and 1903. The first track opened in 1901. It is still in use today as a local public transit line, moving approximately 80,000 people a day who hover between 8 and 12 meters above the surface along a 13-kilometer line that has 20 stations, all but 4 of which are over the river Wupper. The cars are suspended from a single rail built underneath a supporting steel frame. They hang on wheels which are driven by multiple electric motors, and it's fed from a live rail below the running rail. And we're watching it back in action in the early 20th century in this wonderful, wonderful film that's a part of the MoMA's collections. It's just simply amazing. The current fleet of the Schwebebahn consists of 31 articulated cars, but the one we see on the slide here is special. This is the Kaiser Vargan, the Emperor's car. This is the original train used by Emperor Wilhelm II during a test ride on the 24th of October, 1900. It still operated for special events, just like our nostalgia rides when we take out our vintage equipment. And you can really, I think, see the inspiration in Tigerman's illustrations for what he saw, what he thought could work in major cities like New York. And I can really see the progression from Henry Swift's idea. This looks more open, like a more open design. It doesn't seem to block out so much light or take up so much space. 15 years before Tigerman's proposal was sent to the city, however, a different kind of transit had been envisioned and tested in the city. One, however, that was very short-lived. Though a much different design to the Swift and Tigerman systems, which was suspended, the Pelham Park and City Island Railway was actually more like a single-track trolley car, one rail above and one rail below, than a suspended railway. This monorail, which was known as the Flying Lady, was installed in 1910 for a half-mile between Bartow Railroad Station and Marshall's Corner on City Island. For your reference, the map shows where City Island is at the very, very top of the city. August Belmont, who was one of the owners of the IRT, the first subway company, bought controlling stock in this company and pushed the construction of the apparatus to completion by early 1910. At first, the Flying Lady cut the time on this route from about 1 plodding hour in a horse car, a horse-drawn streetcar, to literally just a few minutes as it flew along at speeds in excess of 50 miles per hour. In fact, it needed the speed in order to work properly. Going slower was its eventual downfall because the driver got too jittery going around those curves and slowed it down. And I think the jerry-rig construction, which had cut corners to make the opening deadline, it just basically fell apart. I think this guy was operational for about 4 months. Perhaps the failure actually of the Flying Lady is one reason that the Board of Transportation didn't seem too interested in the Swift or the Tigerman elevated railroads. But certainly as the 1920s progressed and city congestion increased, talk of how to solve congestion problems continued. In fact, it seems that many people envisioned the future city growing up into the sky as the solution to problems of crowding and congestion. And who could blame them? With buildings called skyscrapers getting taller and taller, the population growing, and simply not enough space for everyone. It must have seemed like a real solution going up, but one which required a sort of huge sense of optimism and belief in technology, as well as human ingenuity. This clip is from the 1927 silent film classic Metropolis, which was Fritz Lang's vision of a futuristic urban dystopia. And in our clip, some of the transportation that he imagined we would be using. Cars, trains, and planes are featured prominently. Lang was influenced by trips to New York City in the early 1920s, and he used what he saw to help inform his vision. Interestingly, the downtrodden workers in this film work and live underground, while everybody else gets to live above the ground in the air and the light. And this perhaps reflects some of what we've been learning about a rejection of the underground as a place of advancement and growth, of the subway system as the answer to problems of crowding and congestion, and instead an embrace of a sort of different looking future. Another early visionary movie, this time it had sound, although we're not going to hear it today, was called Just Imagine. It was made in 1930 and portrayed a futuristic vision of New York in 1980. The filmmakers built an enormous model with huge towers, multi-lane traffic systems, and as you saw, aerial traffic cops. The tallest of the models in the movie represented a building that was almost 2,000 feet high. The notion that we would be in private flying vehicles as well as driving cars is really quite interesting when you think about it. Flying in airplanes was not a common experience yet. It's still relatively new technology. Scientific American magazine had a section in their publication called Learning to Use Our Wings. It was so new. Pilots themselves were larger than life figures. Think about Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart, for example. Lindbergh, the first person to fly solo non-stop from New York to Paris in 1927. And Earhart, as well as being the first woman passenger to cross the Atlantic in a plane in 1928, she was also the first woman to make the solo non-stop transatlantic flight in 1932. Both of these folks, trailblazers and world-renowned superstars. New York Mayor Jimmy Walker, who presided over the ticker tape parades for both Lindbergh and Earhart, had a deep interest in aviation and supported the construction of municipal airports for New York, including Floyd Bennett Field and later LaGuardia Airport. These achievements really must have inspired and helped people to believe that perhaps the future was in the sky and that cities could be utopian in nature. And there were more ways for ordinary folks to see these visions of the future than just the movies. In October 1925, thousands of New Yorkers came to the Wanamaker department store in Manhattan at Astor Place to view an exhibition entitled The Titan City, a Pictorial Prophecy of New York, 1926 to 2026, where artworks like the ones on the slide were displayed. According to Invention and Technology magazine, the exhibition typified a new 1920s conception of the urban future, a modern metropolis of high density, advanced technology, and centralized planning. The exhibition espoused a new kind of urban optimism. They shared a resolute faith that science and technology could solve all social problems and shape the urban future. And Wanamaker's, by the way, was the first business that had an entrance inside a subway station, specially built on the original subway line. And the store distributed the very first subway map ever handed out to passengers as a promotion for its store opening in 1904. It seems really fitting that this was the site of this very forward-looking exhibition. In the light of a Titan city, architect Robert Lafferty sent the city his proposal, which he called Airways, in 1927, fully embracing the idea of a mega city that needed to be planned out, especially its transportation needs. His extensive concepts were sent to the chairman of the Board of Transportation, John H. Delaney, by way of an attorney named George Coffin Warner, who was a big supporter of the project proposal. He describes the spirit of his proposal this way. Perhaps it must needs be so in this biggest, richest and most forward-looking city. The project presents opportunity for many able men to help serve the vital needs of their fellows. It challenges the imagination, ingenuity, courage, and ability of our keenest thinkers in many lines. It offers abundant remuneration in cash and fame. It seems adaptable to all the larger cities of the world. It is consonant with the spirit of America, and it needs the cooperation of everyone, for it is designed to serve all. Wow. His vision called for sort of vast railroad bridge-like connectors between a series of huge buildings on which would speed trains connected to single rails, one above and one below, something like the Flying Lady design on City Island. The cars themselves would be much lighter than subway cars. Therefore, they would cost less to operate. They would be less wearing on infrastructure, so easier and less costly to maintain than their subterranean cousins. And they would be able to achieve speeds upwards of 100 miles an hour. Airways would not only carry people, but also freight, and provisions for freight handling would be taken care of inside the buildings. Not only trains for public transit, but also private transportation was accounted for. In fact, in the Airways plan, the existing elevated train lines, New York's first true rapid transit, were to be converted into speedways for cars. It said by removing the railroad tracks and decking the steel supports with concrete and glass slabs for motor roadways, the noise, darkening, and vibrations would be eliminated. Wow. New Yorkers could keep their cars and they could drive them too. Lafferty made many claims for his system, including that it would not only provide traffic congestion relief and additional transportation options, but also it would be a public moral force, and that the gain in individual efficiency, production, and contentment will doubtless help every business and family. Such heightened morale is beyond cash valuing. And as we're looking at the images, I just want to point out that there are also planes flying through his cityscape right there. So though 20 plus years of subways in the city had seen vast changes with where people lived and worked and how people traveled around the city. There were many who believed that we were yet to find the answer to the region's transportation needs. I don't think we found the answer yet in 2024, and efforts continued unabated. Despite the imagination, optimism, and positive outlooks for the future in the 1920s and arguments for a new kind of ideal urban metropolis, the Great Depression in the 1930s, followed by the Second World War in the 40s, dampened so much of that hope and enthusiasm. As far as I know, the city did not latch on to any of the ideas or plans that we examine today, and in fact, doubled down on the subway as the future of public transit, making the world underneath New York rather than above it showcase some of its best and most efficient transportation. Ironically, in light of the arguments made for being above ground in many of today's proposals, the elevated train lines that had been traversing Manhattan for decades became symbols of an outdated past, a hazard to the thousands of cars and buses on the streets, and a blight on the urban environment. They were torn down and demolished in succession, beginning in the late 1930s, surviving only in the outer boroughs where there was always more space. Harvey Corbett, an architect and supporter of Robert Lafferty's Airways, wrote a series of articles for the New York Herald Tribune newspaper, illustrating and expounding on many of these grand ideas of the 1920s. So let's let him have the last word, which is so positive and optimistic, from January 1927. That New York of the future, with its still greater crowds of humans, will be a more captivating city than ever. It will have more open spaces, more parks, more breathing spots where buildings have been leveled and replaced by green swards and trees. Gardens high in the air on the broad roofs of skyscrapers will delight the eye of the beholder from myriad airplanes which will wing their swift way above, or from the promenade decks of great airships drifting down to their mooring masts. What a wonder town is ahead of us, with which to be identified, in which to work. How its mystic power will spur men to accomplishments as yet unthought of, with a dynamic urge not to be denied. So let's hope we can revive some of this 100-year-old optimism as New York continues to grow and develop in this century. I just want to thank you for spending time with us this evening, and please come back for other editions of Mining the Archives when we uncover and examine more gems from deep inside the stacks.
Thank you so much, Polly, for this incredible deep dive. It was so much fun and so well researched and just so fascinating. I think we do have a little bit of time in case there are questions. You can put those into the chat. I think my initial question, just while people were writing, is kind of how did you even find this whole collection of stuff? What led you down this particular rabbit hole?
That's such a great question, Hilary. Yeah, there's just this huge collection that lives in the archive at 130 Livingston, actually. And I've always been interested in it because it's our sort of one of our most sort of human-centered collections, I would say, because it's much of it is about the employees that work for the Board of Transportation. But I came across these 3 boxes, and I think actually on the box it says Citizen Inventions, and I was hooked. I mean, it was simple as that. It was like, oh, what's in here? And then, you find yourself 3 hours later sitting on a concrete floor and you're like, why am I here? And then you know why you're here, because it's fascinating and wonderful stuff.
That's great. We have a question from Sue in the chat. It said, Polly, you mentioned that you couldn't find in the archives a reply to Swift. Made me wonder how the archive continues to grow. How often and from where do you get new artifacts that expand the museum's understanding of the system?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. Just because I haven't come across a reply doesn't mean the reply is not there. I mean, literally, there are folders and folders and folders of this kind of material, and I peeked in just a few folders. In terms of how the museum keeps growing and keeps learning and you know, adapting our understanding and broadening our understanding is very interesting. I mean, the more that we go into our collection, the more that we have opportunities like this to do deep research, the better. And we learn when, you know, other people come and research with us. And then we just have wonderful humans who want to donate things to us all the time. I mean, we have a collection and we think about and have content that, you know, we share our expertise with so many people. And so we learn from our audience as much as we learn from each other, from, you know, our agency. I mean, you know, most of the people that I know that work at the MTA now are really dedicated individuals who really love and appreciate their jobs, and many of them have a deep appreciation for what came before. And so all of us, we all lend something to the understandings of these stories.
Fantastic. And there was a question about just public access. Like, is there public access to the archives?
I actually think that currently the archive is closed to external researchers, but I think that's going to change. We have just been a little understaffed, but that's changing. We have on our website, you can go to our collections and look through our public-facing digital collections, and there are, I think, you know, 15,000 objects on that database. So there's plenty to look through.
Absolutely. I think that was, oh, was there another question was, are there any plans to publish some of these findings, like these kind of stories?
I mean, not at the moment, not beyond, you know, having the opportunity to present this information in this format. But, you know, perhaps there's publishing in the future. I don't know yet. Nice question, though.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for putting this together. I don't know if you know the next topic for our next Mining the Archives yet, or if that's just going to be a surprise.
I think that's going to be a surprise, Hillary.
Okay, well, we'll definitely make sure that everybody knows. And thank you all for joining us this evening. This was really just so much fun. And we'll hopefully be having the next iteration of Mining the Archives within the next few months. I'll just make a couple announcements as we kind of close up. As Polly mentioned, you know, the spirit of citizen interest and engagement with transit planning is still strong, and the MTA actually has some unique opportunities to tap into that collective spirit. One is sharing the data that's collected throughout the system, and they even hosted an open data challenge just in the last few months. So we're actually going to be hosting the MTA's open data team at the museum on January 23rd. And they're going to bring along one of the challenge finalists who's going to present their project, how they've used that data to kind of reinterpret New York's transit stories. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Tickets are available online here. I'm going to put some links really quickly in the chat so you can kind of take a look at those. We are also having the MTA operations team give a lesson on signal basics. That's going to be a virtual program on January 9th at 2 p.m. So you can sign up online, again, with the links in the chat. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. But otherwise, we hope that you join us at the museum. You can reserve tickets on our website. If you enjoyed the program, always consider making a donation or becoming a member, and that really helps keep our programs going. And of course, if you are a member, our next sale for excursions, including City Hall tours, is going to be happening January 15th. So a lot of things coming into the new year. But for right now, I hope everyone has a great rest of your week and a fantastic holiday season, and we will see you in 2025. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.